First Days Amongst the Contrabands by Elizabeth Hyde Botume. Read by Frank Blissett. Chapter 2. Contraband. Origin of the name. In the War of the Rebellion, May 24, 1861, a report was sent to headquarters of the Union Army, which read thus: 3 fugitives, the property of Colonel Mallory, commander of the rebel forces near Hampton, were brought into Fortress Monroe by the picket guard. They represented that they were about to be sent south, and hence sought protection. Major Carey came in with a flag of truce and claimed their rendition under the Fugitive Slave Law, but was informed by General Butler that, under the peculiar circumstances, he considered the fugitives contraband of war. From this time, the ex-slaves were known and designated as contrabands, a name which clung to them for a long time, and which is still heard in some localities. They could not be called freedmen, as emancipation had not yet been declared. Events now crowded upon each other thicker and faster. Wars and rumors of wars filled the land, and all the people were in arms. Early in November 1861, the United States fleet, under command of Commodore S.F. DuPont, arrived off Port Royal Harbor, South Carolina, and on the 7th the rebels abandoned their forts, and the Union forces took possession of the entire country around. This included a group of sea islands, on which were some of the richest and finest plantations to be found in the South. As the Union forces advanced, the rebels retreated to the mainland and left their plantations to the care of the Negroes, who were reported as wild with joy at the defeat of the rebels. They had been shot down, they say, like dogs, because they would not go off with their masters. All the white people had fled. When Beaufort was taken, December 8, there was but one white man to be found, and it was said he was too intoxicated to leave. Negroes poured into the Union lines from all directions. They believed the day of Jubilee had come, and these were their protectors and friends. In Beaufort, the Negroes were pillaging the town. They said the whites were shooting them right and left, in order to drive them back into the interior. One man, whose name was given, was said to have shot 6 of his slaves. That was indeed a time to try men's souls. A time, too, when all were on trial before the world and forced to show what they were good for. The fate and condition of the Negroes became a matter of deep interest to the whole civilized world. Many conflicting reports concerning them were spread abroad. General Thomas F. Drayton, who was a native of the South, but a Union naval officer, while his brother was in the Confederate Army, wrote, "So far from there being any insurrectionary feelings among the Negroes, I have never heard nor seen any act of pillaging, incendiarism, or violence in any direction. It is true that the Negroes of a few plantations have shown a spirit of insubordination by refusing to remove up the country when ordered to do so by their owners, But this disobedience should be assigned rather to a feeling of dismay and utter helplessness at being left alone and unprotected by the precipitate abandonment by their masters of their plantations, than from any organized plan of resistance to the authority they had been accustomed to obey. They are fast recovering from their fright, and coming forth from their hiding places, and quietly and submissively resuming their agricultural labors without the guidance or presence, in many instances, of either master or overseer. Early in the winter, an expedition under Commander Drayton went up the Ch2 River. Not long after, other expeditions were formed to make raids upon the more remote of the sea islands, which had now been entirely abandoned by their owners. The Negroes had been left to take care of themselves, and were in a most demoralized condition. At Hutchinson's Island they were found crouching about some smoking ruins, and were in a most destitute condition. Refugees. The reports of these expeditions, as given by the officers of the gunboats and by the Contrabands themselves, were often touching and amusing in the extreme. An overseer on one of the plantations ran into the house when he heard the boats were in sight, and excitedly called all the Negroes together, saying, "The Yankees are coming! The Yankees are coming! The gunboats are down the river! You must all keep out of sight! Don't let them see you! If they land near here, cut and run and hide where nobody can find you! I tell you them Yanks are the very devil. If they catch you, they will send you to New Orleans or Cuba." "Never fear, we'll run sure. We'll run so de debbil hisself couldn't catch we," they all exclaimed. "Don't you worry, Massa Jim," said the old cook. "We all hear 'bout dem Yankees. Folks tell we they has horns and a tail. I is mighty skeery myself, and I has all my tings pick up, and when I see dem coming, I shall run like all possess." "Well, I am going to the Main, and I leave all here in your care," said the overseer as he rode off. "Goodbye, old man, goodbye, that's right, skedaddle as fast as you kin," said the Negroes as the white man disappeared. "When you catch we again, I spects you'll know it. We's gwine to run sure enough, but we knows the Yankees, and we runs that way." As the boats ascended the river, crowds of poor colored people were seen in some places huddled together or scattered along the shores, screaming and gesticulating in the wildest manner. Some of the more daring leaped into the water, trying to wade or swim to the boats before they were landed. When the gunboats touched the shore, the news spread like wildfire. Men, women, and children rushed frantically to them, begging to be taken on board. There was a curious mixture of hope and fear amongst these wretched creatures. All the white people on the plantations had left precipitately for the interior of the state, taking with them as many of their servants as possible, and leaving the rest to their fate. On some of the places, all the strong and able-bodied slaves had been carried up country by their masters, and only the weak and decrepit had been left behind. In this general stampede for the boats, of course the youngest and strongest were first on board. Those still on shore begged so piteously to be taken care of that they were put in the guardhouse for safekeeping. When order was a little restored, an officer walked past the guardhouse, and, looking in upon the crowd there, said, "Well, what are you all about?" "Dat's jes' what we'd like ter find out, massa," said one of them. Some sad scenes were witnessed. Mothers were separated from their children, and old parents were overlooked. These poor creatures, on the remote plantations of distant islands, had been in the most abject fear for a long time. Now those who had reached what seemed to them safety were wild with delight, and immediately began their jubilant shouting songs. But those left behind unprotected ran along the shore and even rushed into the water, uttering the most heart-rending moans and wailings, which continued until the boat was out of sight and sound. Many grotesque scenes were also witnessed. When the government steamer John Adams anchored at one of the plantations, the negroes rushed along, carrying every conceivable thing on their heads that could possibly be placed there: clothing, blankets, tubs, pots, kettles, pigs, and chickens. One old man had his sick wife on his back, and a half-grown boy had his blind daddy, toting him along to freedom. A huge negress was seen striding along with her hominy pot, in which was a live chicken, poised on her head. One child was on her back, with its arms tightly clasped around her neck and its feet about her waist, and under each arm was a smaller child. Her apron was tucked up in front, evidently filled with articles of clothing. Her feet were bare, and in her mouth was a short clay pipe. A poor little yellow dog ran by her side, and a half-grown pig trotted on before. Another woman staggered under a large rice-straw bed and her blankets. A man had a heavy box-coop filled with fowls. Innumerable were the pathetic and ludicrous stories told by officers and men of scenes which they witnessed on these expeditions. When all these people were brought to Beaufort, the town was full to overflowing. They were quartered in every available place and packed as closely as possible, in churches and storehouses, and in the jail and arsenals. Most of the negro quarters had been taken possession of by the slaves who formerly lived on the island and who had fled from their old masters on the mainland back to their homes. Gangs of these poor refugees were sent to different plantations until there was shelter for no more. There was still a great throng houseless, with no resting place. Tents were put up for them until barracks could be built outside the town, of which Montgomery district was one. Organization of the Contrabands. As soon as military discipline was established on the islands, the officers saw that something must be done to protect the colored people. General T. W. Sherman then issued the following order from Hilton Head, South Carolina, February 6, 1862. The helpless condition of the blacks inhabiting the vast area in the occupation of this command calls for immediate action on the part of a highly favored and philanthropic people. The occupation of a large portion of this area of country on the 7th of November last led to an address to the people of South Carolina, briefly setting forth the causes which led to it, its objects and purposes, and inviting all persons to the reoccupation, in a loyal spirit, of their lands and tenements, and to a continuance of their avocations, under the auspices of their legitimate government and the protection of the Constitution of the United States. The conciliatory and beneficent purposes of that proclamation, except in a few instances, have not only been disregarded, but hordes of totally uneducated, ignorant, and improvident blacks have been abandoned by their constitutional guardians, not only to all the future chances of anarchy and of starvation, but in a state of such abject ignorance and mental stolidity as to preclude all possibility of self-government and self-maintenance in their present condition. Adequate provisions for the pressing necessities of this unfortunate and now interesting class of people being, therefore, now imperatively demanded, even by the dictates of humanity alone, an additional duty, next only in importance to that of the preservation of the world-revered Constitution and Union, is now forced upon us by an unnatural and wicked rebellion. To relieve the government of a burden that may hereafter become insupportable, and to enable the blacks to support and govern themselves in the absence and abandonment of their disloyal guardians, a suitable system of cultivation and instruction must be combined with one providing for their physical wants. Therefore, until proper legislation on the subject, or until orders from a higher authority, the country in occupation of the forces of this command will be divided off into districts of convenient size for proper superintendents. For each of these districts a suitable agent will be appointed to superintend the management of the plantations by the blacks, to enroll and organize the willing blacks into working parties, to see that they are well fed, clad, and paid a proper remuneration for their labor, to take charge of all property on the plantations, whether found there, provided by the government, or raised from the soil, and to perform all other administrative duties connected with the plantations that may be required by the government. A code of regulations on this subject, as well as a proper division of districts, will be furnished in due time. In the meanwhile, and until the blacks become capable of themselves of thinking and acting judiciously, the services of competent instructors will be received, one or more for each district, whose duties will consist in teaching them, both young and old, the rudiments of civilization and Christianity, their amenability to the laws of both God and man, their relations to each other as social beings, and all that is necessary to render them competent to sustain themselves in social and business pursuits. For an efficient and complete organization of this system, there will be appointed 2 general agents, one to have a general superintendence over the administrative or agricultural agents, the other over the educational department. As the blacks are now in great need of suitable clothing, if not other necessities of life, which necessity will probably continue and even increase until the above system gets into working order, the benevolent and philanthropic of the land are most earnestly appealed to for assistance in relieving their immediate wants. Never was there a nobler or more fitting opportunity for the operation of that considerate and practical benevolence for which the Northern people have ever been distinguished. This is what first took me within the lines. Never was there a nobler or more fitting opportunity, said General Sherman. This seemed like a divine call. Opportunities are God's providence. This was our opportunity. The way was opened, and we entered in, not as an enemy, but as friends to humanity. Formation of Freedmen's Aid Societies. The news of General Sherman's order flew to every corner of the North. Intense zeal and enthusiasm for this new field of labor and for those poor wards of government were aroused. Many persons hitherto indifferent to the anti-slavery cause were aroused by deepest pity for those suffering human beings, whether regarded as chattels, abandoned slaves, contrabands of war, or freed people. A crowd of noble men and women were eager to enroll themselves as superintendents, teachers, and assistants. The Educational Committee of Boston, also known as Freedmen's Aid Society, and the National Freedmen's Relief Committee of New York were organized at once and began a work of untold usefulness. Branch societies and auxiliaries were formed in most of the towns in New England. Freedmen's Aid Societies were started in churches of all denominations. Members of families and neighbors joined themselves into independent clubs, all to help on this great work amongst the Negroes. A peaceful expedition to Port Royal. Departure of missionaries. March 3, 1862, Mr. Edward L. Pierce of Boston, government agent in charge of plantations and contrabands at Port Royal, South Carolina, sailed from New York with about 60 persons, 15 of whom were ladies. Of these, 27 gentlemen and 4 ladies were from Boston. 21 gentlemen and 7 ladies from New York, and 3 ladies from Washington and Philadelphia. To this band belongs the proud distinction of inaugurating this noble work. Their departure was heralded as the first missionary expedition to propagate industry, religion, and education among the contrabands at Hilton Head, as well as to encourage agriculture and like useful measures. In this band were persons from diverse positions in life and with varied experiences: mechanics, teachers, business and professional men. Most of these were volunteers who went forth as to a holy mission, ready to do hard work with the strength and spirit of the martyrs of olden times. A few received compensation for their labors from the New York or Boston associations. All were required to take the oath of allegiance to the United States government before going on board the steamer. Each person had a commission from one of the societies, which authorized him to engage in some branch of this work, and each man was required to take oath that he would fight for his country, if occasion required. The men went as superintendents to take charge of the abandoned plantations and of the labors of the Negroes, and the women were to establish industrial schools. All were pledged to look out for the comfort and well-being of these poor, ignorant contrabands. From this time, throughout the entire North, There was a constantly increasing interest in this work. A great number of men and women, old and young, flocked to the societies, eager to be enrolled as laborers in this new field. Very many more than there were places for. Indeed, it seemed sometimes, if transportation and subsistence could be secured for so many, there might be a special superintendent and teacher for each colored family already emancipated. At first it was exceedingly difficult to get transportation papers, and a permit to enter the military department was a privilege accorded to but few of the great army of applicants. Subsistence was a matter of profound faith to these pioneers. They believed they should find food and shelter and be taken care of like the birds of the air, and they were. Neither government nor societies could do more than open the way, and those that entered therein must literally gird on their armor and go on with brave hearts and determined wills. Happy for all if to these were added earnestness and steadiness of purpose, and enthusiasm for the work, with a sympathy and pity for the past of the Negroes, and faith in their future. One of the volunteer teachers, wife of an officer in the first SCCR, wrote of her experience in teaching. She dated from Mill's plantation. My school is constantly deranged by the changes of the camps, and the attendance interrupted by the duties of picket guard. By far the most interest and best progress are shown by the boys, who are not often called away from the school. I asked one day, "Who is President of the United States?" They all agreed it was Uncle Sam. One scholar, who proved not to know one letter from another, said, "I larn a little in Secesh, but come away for I finish my education." His zeal in traveling 100 miles at night and risking his life at every step to get to freedom is shown in his school duties. I am provided with a government tent, which my scholars have floored with pine sprays and surrounded with rough pine branches, and I find it as comfortable and pleasant as any schoolroom can be. Many of my old scholars are at present beyond reach, being on guard duty, etc. They often express a wish to me to be taught, and I find them with books in hand, making the best use of the little knowledge they have acquired. That was Chapter 2, Contraband, from First Days Amongst the Contrabands, by Elizabeth Hyde Botume, read by Frank Blissett.